Hello, everybody. We have reached our final lesson here on the causes of the Civil War. One thing that you've probably figured out here by now is that, you know, we look back at the causes of the Civil War. I mean, it's not one thing or one event that causes the Civil War, right? I mean, there are certain themes throughout, like the expansion of slavery, most definitely. But especially starting at the end of the Mexican War in 1848, all the way up through 1860 and 1861. It's like rapid fire. Bad presidents, bad laws, you know, fugitive slaves, attempted compromises, anti-slavery novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's like a 12 to 13 year buildup, so much so to the point where it's inevitable that the country sort of can't stay together and the compromise is going to no longer cut it. So let's go ahead and get started with our last section. So one group of people that we have not yet heard from yet relating to the causes of the Civil War is the Supreme Court, right? So the main job of the Supreme Court is to not create law, but interpret the law. So in 1857, the Supreme Court reaches a verdict regarding a case that had been going through lower courts for quite a while. So there was a slave by the name of Dred Scott, and Dred Scott claimed that he should be a free man. Now, the issue surrounding Dred Scott's freedom was that Dred Scott was a slave who was owned by an army surgeon. So this army surgeon brought his slave Dred Scott with him to free territory. And Dred Scott lived with his owner in free territory for years, right? So the argument that was made in this lawsuit was that as a slave, if you spend a certain amount of time in free territory, you become free, right? So this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the court has to determine if Dred Scott, gets his freedom, right? So if we take a look at the ruling, and I'm not going to highlight the whole ruling, but there are certain things in this ruling that really stick out as being extremely pro-slavery, right? So not only do they rule, not only does the Supreme Court say that Dred Scott has to remain a slave, the Supreme Court goes beyond the actual facts of the case and makes comments about the expansion of slavery and slavery in the United States in general. So the Supreme Court says that if you are a black person, you're not a citizen of the United States. So every right that a citizen would have, Supreme Court basically says, African American people, not citizens, the law does not apply to them, right? So basically, the court says that Dred Scott does not even have the right to bring his case to court, right? So they said it doesn't matter if the merits of his case are good or bad. As a black man, he's not a citizen. He has no rights, okay? And then most importantly, the Supreme Court says Congress, the lawmaking body in the country, they don't have the right to restrict slavery anywhere. So basically, moving forward, you can bring your slaves anywhere. That was the opinion of the Supreme Court in 1857. As you can imagine, people in the North lose their minds, right? It was kind of established that slavery was going to stay where it was. It might expand to a few new places. But now the Supreme Court comes out and says slavery can go anywhere. So that's a really, really extreme decision. I would describe the Dred Scott decision as the most racist Supreme Court ruling in American history. And that's really saying a lot, because if you look at some of those old cases, a lot of them did reach racist verdicts. Key word here, radicalize. So it radicalized the North. People in the North did not agree with this, and they felt like the Supreme Court went way too far, right? So it actually took two constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War to kind of counteract the Dred Scott case. And at the very end of the year, we're going to briefly discuss the 13th and 14th Amendment. This next item on our timeline, to be honest, it really isn't a cause of the Civil War. But I did want to include the Tariff of 1857 to sort of maybe highlight a bigger point, right? So in an earlier presentation, right, highlighting the causes of the Civil War, one thing I said was that there are some fringe historians who claim that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery or the expansion of slavery. These fringe historians will say things like it was economic sectionalism, right, or economic reasons primarily not related to slavery that caused the Civil War. So in 1857, tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, were decreased by 20 to 25%, right? So this was like one of the largest tariff decreases in American history. And the reason why they could do this was because the federal government had such a surplus in terms of their budget that they didn't have the need for tariff revenue. So I put this on here not because it's a cause of the Civil War, but because the evidence shows here that because tariffs were lowered so significantly 3 years before Southern secession, it kind of clearly shows that tariffs were not the main cause, or even really a major cause, of the Civil War. Now, it should be noted that when the Civil War started, there was much more of a need for government income because we were, the North was fighting a war against the South. So tariffs were drastically increased in 1861. So now we need to move back to Kansas. So if you remember, in 1854, a law was passed called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that law repealed the Missouri Compromise and instead relied upon a principle called popular sovereignty to determine the future of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. So if you forget, popular sovereignty was the idea that you should open up a territory, let people move in, and then have the residents of that territory cast their vote, basically asking whether they want to be a slave state or a free state. So in 1855, fighting breaks out in Kansas between pro and anti-slavery settlers. History records this as Bleeding Kansas, right? So in the meanwhile, Kansas is in the process of moving from a territory, and now they want to come in as a state. But so many different pro-slavery groups and anti-slavery groups had moved into Kansas that nobody really knew, like, okay, who's the majority here? So what happened was there were 4 separate constitutions drawn up for Kansas. And the 2 most famous ones, there was a anti-slavery constitution and there was a pro-slavery constitution. The pro-slavery constitution was called the Lecompton Constitution. So if you were pro-slavery, you made the argument, let's have a vote. If the people of Kansas vote for the Lecompton Constitution, then Kansas is a slave state. Now, the president, James Buchanan, stood up in front of Congress, right, and supported the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, right? But then when they put the Lecompton Constitution up to the voters, it was overwhelmingly defeated. So during the Civil War, Kansas was admitted as a free state. This whole argument over this pro-slavery constitution and Buchanan siding with it, even though it went against the interest of the voters, represent one of the worst moments of Buchanan's presidency and the continuing battles over whether these new territories would have slavery or whether they wouldn't have slavery. So all of you, I think, are aware at this time, the school year, like politics is one of my things, right? And, in politics, there's nothing more sort of representative of what politics is all about than, political debates. So when people are, running for political office and they face off, where they each get to speak about what they believe in front of crowds and people ooh and ah and boo and cheer. That's a big part of the way that politics works, right? So if we go back to 1858, we're now 2 years before the election of Abraham Lincoln and Southern secession. So there was a pretty high-profile election in 1858. Now, this election was not for president. You had two men who both wanted to be senator of the state of Illinois. Now, in 1858, senators were not elected by the people. Senators were appointed. But both of the two men I'm about to reference hope that their party wins in 1858, and as a result, they get picked to be the next senator of the great state of Illinois. So let's go through the two men, all right? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a one-term congressman from Illinois. He was a Whig, but then when the Whig Party went away after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln becomes a Republican, right? That northern-only political party. And the man that he is running against, Stephen Douglas, if you probably remember his name, he was the guy that helped get the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. He wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that started in Illinois and then went all the way to the West Coast. So Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, two rather high-profile guys, both hoping to be senator from Illinois. So here's the deal. These debates were about one issue and one issue only, the issue of slavery in America. So what you got in these debates was you got two guys involved in politics on a high level arguing their thoughts about the future of slavery in America. So all in total, there were 7 debates. And this is how they used to do debates back in this time period. They would let one man talk for 60 minutes. 60 minutes you had the floor. You could say whatever you wanted. Then the second guy would have 90 minutes, an hour and a half, to give a rebuttal. And then the first guy would get a chance to give a 30-minute closing statement rebuttal, right? Now, the interesting thing about these debates were that in these 7 locations, there were some locations that loved Lincoln, and there were other locations that loved Douglas. So these men sometimes had to stand up in front of either friendly or hostile crowds, and they were both very bright men, but they had opposite views or very differing views on the future of slavery in America. So historians study these debates to kind of get a view on what was going on in America in the years just before the Civil War, right? So just so you know, Stephen Douglas did end up winning the Senate seat, right, or being appointed senator in Illinois, all right? There are a few important things from these debates I'll highlight for you. Stephen Douglas advocated for something called the Freeport Doctrine. It's named after the location where this debate was taking place, and he speaks about it in one of his speeches, right, when he's debating, okay? He said that basically if a local area didn't want slavery, like a town or something, they didn't have to have it. And this really made the South very angry. So when Stephen Douglas ends up running for president a few years later, the South remembers what he says here, and this causes Douglas to lose major support in the South, right? So these debates were widely reprinted, like transcripts were printed in the newspaper. And even though this was an election, that was taking place in Illinois, people from all over America are hearing what these two smart guys have to say about slavery. And what we also see is that all of a sudden people start talking about this guy Abraham Lincoln, and they're like, man, this guy Lincoln, he's really something, and maybe he's got a brighter political future than we thought. 2 years after these debates and this election in 1858, Abraham Lincoln's running for president, representing the Republican Party. So this quote we're going to look at is something that Abraham Lincoln said in one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? So we usually tend to think of Lincoln as, the man who freed slaves, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, right, during the Civil War. But you have to keep in mind, Lincoln was also a politician, right? Politicians, in order to survive, need to get elected, right? So even though Abraham Lincoln, in his core, does not believe in slavery, Lincoln is very moderate on the issue of slavery. Lincoln is not an abolitionist, right? He would never want to be lumped in with those radicals, okay? He wants to protect the rights of Americans. He wants to uphold the Constitution. He acknowledges that slaves are property, but in his heart, he does feel that slavery is wrong. So let's read through this quote that Lincoln says, during this debate. He says, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people." So remember, like most Americans in this era, in the 1850s, right, did not believe that the two races, right, were equal. So if you're a politician running for office in Illinois, you have to convince these moderate voters, these voters who aren't sure who they want to vote for, that you're not too extreme, right? So Lincoln is a guy who he often has to say things to put voters at ease, right? So it's kind of ironic here that when Lincoln ends up getting elected president, the southern states, their first instinct is to say, we're out of here. This guy Lincoln's a radical. But when you go back and you look at some of the things that Lincoln says, to the modern ear, they could be viewed as being very racist, right? He's saying white and black people aren't equal. Black people should never be able to vote, be jurors, or hold office, right? And that's just something to keep in mind, right? When we look back in history, Lincoln is a man of his time. Lincoln is a man who supports the idea that, yes, slavery should end, but maybe you should pay the slave owner. Or maybe you should end slavery, and we know that Lincoln believed that probably the best course for African American people was to send them to a different country, right? Africa or South America, that idea of colonization. So if you take one thing away from Lincoln's beliefs about slavery, it's that he was moderate, he was against slavery, right? But he was not an abolitionist, right? He was somebody who looked for a solution somewhere in the middle regarding slavery. Earlier in our timeline, one name that came across was the name John Brown. So in Kansas, in Bleeding, Kansas, John Brown was an anti-slavery fighter. And in Kansas, John Brown and a crew of his men commit murder. It was called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. So John Brown was not done with his crusade against slavery after his actions in Kansas. So John Brown was basically a fugitive from the law. He was still, accused of murder. So he basically went to go hide. He grew a huge beard. So if we look at a picture of John Brown here, we see he's got like this huge he's got this huge Old Testament beard. So he goes into hiding. And whereas Abraham Lincoln was not a radical, John Brown was the most radical abolitionist in America. And the reason why John Brown is considered so radical is he made the argument that slavery could only be ended in America with violence. The plan that John Brown is most associated with in history is in 1859. John Brown identifies a town that he wants to attack for the purposes of starting a large slave rebellion in America. The town that John Brown wanted to attack was Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So I've actually been to Harper's Ferry. It's about an hour to an hour and a half from Washington, D.C., if you head west. In in today's map, with today's map, it's actually in West Virginia. But back then, West Virginia and Virginia were combined. They split up during the Civil War. John Brown picks Harper's Ferry because it was the location of a gun factory, and it's where the U.S. military kept their weaponry. So they call that an armory or an arsenal. John Brown's idea was to take a group of men, a group of abolitionists. Some of the men were former slaves, some of them were his sons. And John Brown wants to attack this town. He wants to go to where the guns are. He wants to steal guns from the U.S. military. And then he wants slaves on nearby plantations to come help him. Brown could give the weapons to the slaves, and together the slaves and John Brown's crew of 21 men could start a slave rebellion that would spread all over America. And then when all was said and done, Brown, his men, and the slaves could start their own country in the mountains where everybody was equal. Sounds like a great plan, doesn't it? So here's what happens. John Brown moves into the Harper's Ferry area. He rents a house under a fake name. Him and his crew stake out Harper's Ferry. They take notes on where the guards are, when the shift changes, all that stuff. In October of 1859, John Brown and his men attacked the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They very easily got control of the weapons. Now, what Brown and his men did not realize was that the people who lived in Harper's Ferry were going to fight back. John Brown and his men had no other recourse once the townspeople start firing than to go run into a building, right? It was a fire engine house. So basically like a fire department building. And John Brown and his men were stuck there. So the word gets to President James Buchanan that John Brown and a crew of his men attacked the federal arsenal. The closest troops to Harper's Ferry were U.S. Marines, led by a name that you've probably heard of, Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee ends up being a very famous Southern Civil War general, but at this time he's still in the United States Army. John Brown is stuck in the building. He hears a knock on the door. Brown is alerted that Robert E. Lee and his Marines are surrounding the fire engine house, and that if they don't come out, the Marines are going to break down the door SWAT team style. Brown refuses to budge. So the Marines use a battering ram, they break down the door, they attack Brown and his men, and in the span of a couple minutes, all of Brown's men were either captured or killed. So, in this moment, John Brown is put in jail, and John Brown knows he's going to be put on trial. Brown knew that he had no legal defense for what he did in Harper's Ferry. But John Brown argues that what he did was right by the laws of God. And because this trial was so high profile, anything that John Brown said in court was going to be printed in newspapers all over America. So John Brown uses his time in court to put the country on trial. He says, this country's a disgrace, that I started the war against slavery, and now we're going to finish it. So John Brown was sentenced to hang for his crime of treason. The government was so convinced that there was going to be a riot or an attempt to save Brown, troops from all over were brought in as security forces during this hanging. John Brown was hanged. He was killed. But let's go down to significance here, right? John Brown became, let's take a look where it is, right? Oh, here it is. John Brown became a martyr. A martyr is somebody who dies for a cause. So all these people who were anti-slavery in America, they looked to John Brown as the man who got, the Civil War started. John Brown's attack caused hysteria and paranoia in the South. So much so that in the South, a lot of politicians made the argument that if a Republican ever gets elected president, we're going to have somebody like John Brown in the White House. When Abraham Lincoln runs for president in 1860, guess who people in the South say that Abraham Lincoln is just like? He's a radical like John Brown. That wasn't the truth, but there was a lot of conspiratorial thought going on in the South. And the fear of slave rebellions and all Republicans being labeled as radical abolitionists, this would go on to become one of the biggest reasons why the South eventually decides to leave. We have finally reached the end of our Civil War, causes of the Civil War timeline. What we have arrived at in this last item here is the proximate cause of the Civil War. And by proximate cause, what I mean is, what event directly led Southern states to secede or leave the United States? And the answer to that question is the results of the presidential election of 1860. So in 1860, the first thing that should catch your eye is there were 4 men running for president. You had a Republican, Abraham Lincoln. You had a Southern Democrat by the name of John Breckinridge. You had a Northern Democrat by the name of Stephen Douglas. And you had a guy running, I think the party, they called themselves the Constitutional Union Party, ran a guy named John Bell. So a few things about this. Number one, the Republicans ran their first presidential candidate in 1856, and they were about 3 states away from winning, okay? 2, there were 2 Democrats running for president in 1860. The Democratic Party was so divided up along regional lines that they could not decide on one person. So the Southern Democrats pick one person, the Northern Democrats pick another, and that basically splits up the Democratic vote. John Bell argued that we should just compromise and ignore slavery altogether, right? Even though the country was ready to explode over the issue of slavery, John Bell made the argument, if we just don't bring it up and we avoid it and we try to compromise, everything will be okay. That was definitely not the solution at this point. So Lincoln ends up winning the election. And the reason why Lincoln is able to win is he wins the entire North. So Lincoln wins the entire North, and the other 3 candidates carve up the remaining states. When you look at the results, Lincoln only got 40% of the popular vote. Now, the popular vote is not used to select the president. But a lot of the time, Americans like to believe that the president who wins the Electoral College should also win the popular vote as a sign of saying that a majority of Americans support whoever won. If you look at it another way, so out of 10 people who voted in 1860, 6 out of 10 voted for somebody besides Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln, even though he won the Electoral College, is going to come in as president where a lot of Americans do not support him. So Lincoln is smart. When he's elected, he promises, I will not abolish slavery. So everyone is saying in the South that Lincoln is a radical. He's John Brown 2.0. Lincoln makes the promise. No rash action. I won't abolish slavery where it exists. I'm not going to touch slavery in the South. The South has absolutely nothing to worry about. So, of course, the South doesn't believe him, and the 7 states of the Deep South say, see you later, we're out of here. So let's highlight a few things. The first, Lincoln's election was the direct cause or the proximate cause of Southern secession. So people who argue that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, those fringe historians, right? If the Civil War wasn't about slavery, what was it about then? Why was the South so mad that Abraham Lincoln got elected? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that the Civil War was about anything else. Now, were there other things that divided the North and South besides slavery? Yes. But in 1860, the southern states leave the United States because they don't want Abraham Lincoln, who they view as an abolitionist, even though he wasn't, as president. The first state to leave the country was South Carolina. That shouldn't shock you. In the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the state who threatened to leave America in that nullification crisis was South Carolina. After the first shots of the Civil War were fired, 4 more southern states left the United States. So, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, 7 states secede. After the war starts, 4 more leave. So how many states consisted of the, how many states did the Confederate States of America or the Confederacy consist of during the Civil War? It was a total of 11. Okay, next. The South believed that Lincoln was a radical. Even though Lincoln said it over and over again, I am not a radical, I will not touch your slaves, the South simply didn't believe him. Personally, I think that the main reason why the South should be viewed so negatively is because the South did not respect the results of the presidential election of 1860. So, in 1860, the American public voted. And according to the rules of America, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. The South was unable to accept the fact that Abraham Lincoln was their president. In the modern day, people say, oh, if Obama gets reelected, I'm leaving the country. If Trump becomes president, I'm leaving the country. It's kind of empty rhetoric. But in 1860, America was so divided over the future of slavery that the election of Abraham Lincoln was enough to convince the South that they should just simply leave. Let's wrap this up, everybody. A few quick final points to make on the election of 1860, right? So in the top left, we have our 4 candidates. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, right? At this time, Republicans were only really in the North, so it was a Northern-only political party. But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the entire North. John Breckinridge was your pro-slavery Southern Democrat. Stephen Douglas was your Northern Democrat. And John Bell was your Constitutional Union Party. Let's just ignore slavery altogether. If we go underneath that, one thing we see with the popular vote, even though it doesn't matter per se, this pie graph shows how divided American voters were in 1860. I think it also brings us to another major point. I often hear Americans say things like, there should be more than 2 political parties, or there should be more than two major choices for president. The more options that you have for president, the more divided up the vote is going to be. So if in America, if there were 8 political parties, you could hypothetically have somebody be elected president who got 30% of the vote. In America, we like majorities. So when you have 2 people run for president, it's it's almost always guaranteed that the person who wins the election also usually gets a majority of the vote, and that's something that historically Americans have been comfortable with. Let's move next door. So let's highlight something here. The Confederacy had 11 states in it. There were 4 slave states that never left the United States. In history, we call Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware border states. So during the Civil War, there were 4 slave states that did not leave. Those 4 states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, are referred to in the Civil War era as the border states. Every decision that Abraham Lincoln made as president, he had to keep in mind that if he was too extreme in his action, these border states would leave and join the Confederacy, making them stronger. last but not least here, top right-hand corner. Everywhere where you see the dark black was a state won by Abraham Lincoln in the election. So how does Abraham Lincoln, while only getting 40% of the popular vote, become president? The vote everywhere else was really, really split up. But in the North, there was a lot of population, there was a lot of electoral votes, and Lincoln was able to win the entire North. All right, everybody, we have reached the end of the causes of the Civil War. We're going to have a quiz early next week, so we'll see how you do with that. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you soon.